Billy Creekmore, Chapter 2. I frighten the snake-handling preacher and Mr. Beetle. Then I tell Rufus a secret. By the time the sun filled the chapel, the preacher was deep in his sermon, and everything about us was a sin. Copperheads and rattlers coiled round both wrists, and he was slogging back and forth, telling us we was destined for hell. He was a rickety man with a curved back and bent knees. His cheeks were sunk from all the teeth missing in the back of his mouth. Talking about our sins filled him with energy. He went on and on, huffing and puffing like he was putting out a fire. And those that's filled with envy, and those that's filled with wrath, and those that's born to debtors and thieves and the wanton, all of you sitting here is halfway to the devil. For land's sake, can't we do nothing right? Whispered Rufus. I can't help it if my daddy's in jail. Like me, Rufus's mother was dead, but he knew where his daddy was, locked in the jailhouse for stealing a ham. Nope, I whispered back. Seems like we was sinning the moment we was born poor. The preacher started calling boys up to the altar so they could see how the snakes weren't daring to strike as he was filled with righteousness. First he called up Meek Jones, the humblest, scaredest boy at the orphanage. Meek's about as sinful as a daisy, whispered Rufus. I'd like to see him call Walter Barnes, I whispered back, rolling my eyes at the thought. He'd kick those snakes right out of his hands. Well, I shouldn't have known to keep myself in church. The preacher's eyes were roaming the aisles, and he managed to glance my way just as my eyes was rolling in my head. He thought I was talking to a spirit and giving him the evil eye. He staggered back like I'd hit him with a pole. Lord in heaven, he called out, trembling in front of the altar. There's one among us conversing with a demon right here in God's house. Well, the snake started rattling and hissing because of his own nervousness, but the preacher didn't realize that. Don't do it, Billy Creekmore, he called out. Don't tell those serpents to strike me. Next thing you know, Mr. Beetle stomped over to me. His switch was out, and he was all set to save the preacher by beating me out of my bad intention. Fortunately, my mind started ticking and my mouth filled with words. Just in time, I stumbled out to the aisle and fell onto my knees, lying my head off and calling out for everyone to hear. Oh, please, dear Lord, take away this evil spirit. It's telling me awful things. It's set to harm the preacher here in your church. Oh, please take it away. I waved my arms about and dropped my head like I couldn't bear seeing what was before me. Well, if I told you my act managed to stop Mr. Beetle in his tracks while getting every set of eyes and ears glued on me at the same time, I would not be lying. Everyone thought they were witnessing someone fighting off a spirit and talking to God. It was silent except for me, and I was halfway between believing myself and laughing out loud with the power I felt. This time, storytelling saved me from the switch, and I was right relieved. Naturally, the service took a turn after that, and nothing went along in the usual way. Somehow or other, the preacher pulled the snakes off himself without being bit. Then he started praying over me with Mr. Beetle himself dropped to his knees. The boys sang some hymns for my soul while I knelt in the aisle, acting pious and remorseful. Up by the altar, the snakes were coiled in their little wire box, hissing so loud you could hear them in the silence between hymns. For a while I was singled out and special, even if it was for being purified of a demon. On the walk back, some of the boys drifted behind like they was afraid, while some clustered around me like I might help 'em see visions of their own. No one stepped on my heel or sent a rock singing my way, which are just two of the things boys did when the grown-up wasn't looking. But it didn't last. An hour later, I was just another Appalachian orphan at the Guardian Angels Home for Boys, the charity farm for the sons of the wayward and the dead, doing Sunday chores. Some was repairing the fence and some was cleaning the pigsty. I was a mean-spirited little farm. It was a mean-spirited little farm, dreary and run down. All the farm animals were angry and fierce, nothing cuddly or cute at all. Chickens pecked us and geese nipped our heels. Barn cats darted out from bales of hay just to hiss and scratch at the air when we passed. The haggard old mule stared at us from his stall with dull eyes. "What'd that ghost look like?" asked Rufus. It was early afternoon, and we was spreading straw on the barn floor. Seemed to be awful threatening. Oh, he was handsome. Wore a top hat and carried a watch chain. Looked like he was a millionaire when he was alive. "How about that?" he said. "Wonder why such a good-looking spirit would want to harm the preacher." "He didn't say," I replied quick, hoping he'd drop the subject. Honestly, pretending to see spirits could be an awful burden. I didn't want to be dishonest with Rufus, but I didn't know how to get out of the lie. Plus, it was hard to explain. I sensed spirits, but I didn't see 'em. It weren't nothing like what I went on about in the chapel. It was altogether different from my storytelling, which I could tap into any time I wanted. I didn't have no control over sensing spirits. Maybe the spirit don't like the way the preacher tries to scare us to heaven with his snakes. Bet you're right, I said. The cows started mooing and stamping, turning to glare at us with their great moony eyes. They didn't like talking. On our way out of the barn, Rufus and I put down our pails of milk to give the mule a pat. One night, Rufus, you and I are going to ride this mule out of here. He's going to take us to a new life away from the beetles and the preacher. Rufus scratched him under his chin, and his eyes almost flickered with pleasure. I don't know, Billy. This mule is awful beaten down. Why, he don't even have a name. Well, I started. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I know someone going off to a new life. This morning I heard Mr. Beetle tell Peggy that one of the boys was leaving with Mr. Colder tonight to apprentice in his factory. Is that the truth? Well, I wonder who it could be. I'm betting on Walter Barnes, I said. He's getting so nasty, I'm thinking Mr. Beetle would like to get rid of him. You could be right, Rufus replied, but it seems to me he's too big. I think Willis would take to the work better. Rufus had such a grown-up way of talking. He was awful smart for a little boy. Didn't seem to be growing none, but kept up with his reading and writing better than anyone else at the orphanage. The rest of the day went by dreary and slow. We painted and weeded, repaired and swept. At the end of the day, we was glad to sit down and eat our supper. A few of us stayed behind afterward, drying plates and wiping pots, listening to Peggy tell us about the circus she saw in Albright last year. It was grand, boys, grand. Trick riders and acrobats and a tableau of Roman statues. The actors were painted white from head to toe, and they were so still in their poses you thought they were made of marble instead of flesh and blood. Imagine, said Rufus, his eyes bright with wonder. We all agreed it seemed like a fine life, traveling and performing and making up new acts to dazzle folks in your spare time. Just then an automobile came up the road. It was Mr. Colder. All of us boys ran out and cheered him, waving our caps so he'd blow the horn for us. It was the only automobile we ever saw, and it was terribly exciting. He sounded the horn a few times for us, then waddled to the porch to shake hands with Mr. Beetle. When the two men disappeared into the house, some of the boys dared to climb in the car and sit in the seats. I watched them take turns sitting in the driver's seat, pretending to drive off. Who was going to be the lucky one, I wondered. They was happy as could be, turning the wheel and inspecting the hood ornament. Pretty soon Peggy came onto the porch and scolded us for touching what warn't ours. I'm warning you, Mr. Beetle will be coming out here in a moment, making such a racket you are. Someone will be getting the switch for sure. No one paid attention till she stomped her foot. Then off they scattered, and the lot of us went to bed.